I'd say the biggest influence on my life in teaching has been and actually I mentioned this in your group on Facebook a couple months ago because somebody asked such a phenomenal question about like taking criticism well as a pastor. And there's this guy in my congregation, Gary, who now is a mentor of mine, but he started off as he's a guy whose kids went through my student ministry, and he's a PhD in New Testament. He studied at Durham while N.T. Wright was the bishop there. Wrote his dissertation on the word charis in 1 Corinthians and just all this ridiculous stuff. And so, as you can imagine, being like a 24-year-old youth pastor who gets to teach twice a year, and you get up there and you just give it your best fastball. And I would get off stage and he would always have something to say. And it always felt like criticism. It always felt like, gosh, man, leave me alone, But as I started to listen more and we started to get to know each other more outside of that context, it really he became my sounding board and really, I mean, like I said, he's a mentor now because now, I can engage with him and he can engage with me in a way that, like, if it weren't for him and people like him, his wife also she studied at Oxford and so like they're just tremendous in general, but like, and they're career missionaries in Eastern Europe. And so just like they have a license to speak into my life as a pastor and a teacher that most people don't. And I've gotten to a point where I'm receptive with them to where when he says, hey, I remember just a couple months ago, I got off stage and I had taught and everything, and he was in there and it was the first service and I had another service to do, and he was leaving and he said he's like, the one thing he said, what are you trying to get across? What's the goal? And I tried to I kind of stumbled through it, oh, I want people to walk away with that. And he kind of in between services helped me understand hey, you're like a shotgun shell, right? It's all across he's like, but this is in between, Mike, this is in between two services. Okay. And he's like, get your thesis statement down and cut everything else out. And I remember, I went back to my little office and did that. And I remember after the second service being like, man, he was right. And it hurts. Like when people are right, we don't want them to be, but him and his wife, Karen, and then quite a few other people, I'm sure too. I work with guys who are phenomenal teachers in their own right too. So I've grown immensely, but it has almost, nothing to do with me. Everything to do with the Holy Spirit and the people God has put in my life that can speak into me as a pastor.
Hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast, episode 158. I'm your host, Mike Neglia, and the voice that you heard right there at the beginning is Pastor Jeremy Jenkins. And you're about to hear a fascinating and encouraging conversation that I've titled, Faithful Are the Wounds of a Friend. And the reason why is because in the beginning and even in the middle of this conversation, Jeremy speaks about some pivotal and important roles of feedback and mostly critique that he heard and grew from over the years. And teacher, preacher, Bible study leader, pastor, you need critique in your life as well. Learning from peers, learning from older mentors is valuable. Sometimes it stings, but it always is for your growth. Towards the end, we talk about the role of apologetics and worldview analysis and how that fits in our Bible teaching and preaching. And guys, Jeremy is just the person to help you think this through. He's got a degree in Intercultural Studies, and apologetics is an important aspect of his ministry at All Things, All People. In the show notes, there's going to be a link to his podcast, the All Things, All People podcast, which really helps people to think Christianly about the world. Anyway, I'm going to get out of the way, and here's my conversation with Jeremy Jenkins. Hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast. I'm here with Jeremy Jenkins, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you, Jeremy, for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man, it's my honor.
So Jeremy, I know you from the All Things, All People podcast, a fellow Good Lion podcast, but why don't you maybe introduce yourself beyond the podcast to us and to the listeners?
Yeah, so so as you mentioned, I run All Things, All People, which we have a podcast, and we just want to teach Christians how to think like Christians, but my not only my full-time gig vocationally, but I would even say calling wise, and where I spend most of my time and energy is in pastoring, kind of like you and a lot of the guys in Good Lion, and so I'm one of the lead pastors at a church called Element Church in Forest City, North Carolina. My title is Missions and Mobilization Pastor, which is just kind of we're kind of a 200 to 300 person church in a rural area in North Carolina, and so the titles really don't mean anything because we all do everything, Okay. So I serve on a lead team with two other guys, and I've been here about 10 years. Undergraduate from Liberty University in Virginia, and then became a youth pastor. Kind of followed the path that a lot of guys do. I mean, I became a youth pastor here, and then I've actually been here since, moved into a different role in leadership. And so I have my wife Courtney and two kids, Luke and Savannah. And as I was telling you pre-show, I'm a fan of your show, and has benefited me greatly. We actually mentioned Expositors Collective on the last episodes of the All Things All People podcast. So I'm excited to have a conversation with you, because I've heard other people have conversations with you, and it's sort of surreal to be in this spot today.
I don't know what to say, but so I'm just going to awkwardly move on. But that's very kind. So here's the first question. You know it's coming. So why don't you tell us about your first sermon that you ever preached? When did you begin, and how did it go?
It was horrible. So the first sermon, I suppose, would have happened in like a classroom at Liberty, in one of the classes where they just kind of said, "Hey, here's a text and you're going to preach it." I don't consider that, because it didn't happen in the context of the local church. And while sometimes it certainly feels like we get graded on our sermons at church, I got a grade that day, and it doesn't seem to qualify. But yeah, so I was serving, believe it or not, I had a professor in Liberty University is a Baptist school, as most people know. Yeah. I don't really consider myself a Baptist, but that's just where I've been operating for the last 14 years. But the professor and I, took a liking to each other, and he was a Baptist, and he was actually serving at a United Methodist church in rural, like very, very, very rural Virginia. And the UMC at the time, and probably still, was struggling so badly to get pastors that they had basically put in their bylaws that you could call Baptist preachers to be UMC pastors. And so he kind of considered himself a missionary, in the sense that, he's crossing denominational lines, because he was serving as basically an interim, and he called me to be the youth pastor. So I went to this little tiny country 40-person church, and my now wife and I served there for like 3 years. And wow. That's where I preached my first sermon. It was on Mother's Day of probably like 2010, 2011. And I remember I preached the genealogy in Matthew, and I focused on the four women in the genealogy in Matthew, which as a Bible student, I thought, good Lord, this is the most advanced thing. We're preaching a genealogy, and it's perfectly aligned with Mother's Day, because here's these four women. And at that point, I thought, I don't know. I mean, I think everybody has this thought. I thought, man, I'm going to kill this. This is going to be awesome, And my girlfriend at the time, now wife, was there, and then a couple friends actually came and listened to it. And I remember my roommate, who was the best man at my wedding, and he's just this brutally honest guy. I remember I came down, we were talking, and you would have thought I was Billy Graham by the way the people in the church reacted, because they're just like these really sweet, wonderful Southern country folk, and they just loved me. I could have gotten up there and read the dictionary, and they would have thought it was great. But so I went to this guy, Brad, and I was like, "Hey man, what'd you think?" And he was just kind of like, "Yeah, it could have been better, and I remember just kind of processing through that, and now I look back, like you and I were messaging, and you sent me a picture that you had found our sermon archive on our website, and even from a few months ago, I saw you were watching a sermon, and I was like, oh no, not that one. So I look fondly on the experience of my first sermon, but I'm sure if I had a recording of it, there was probably heresy in there. There was probably horrible hermeneutics, and all sorts of other things that I'm not proud of. But it was a great experience, and and I look back now as somebody who serves in like a lead role and say, how wonderful was it of Dr. Stevens was his name to give me that opportunity. I'm not 100% sure he should have, but it seemed to work out at least to this point. So yeah, it was a fun experience.
Yeah, and so what was kind of the takeaway of the sermon? Did you just kind of say, "Hey, listen, there's Gentiles, and they're women. Happy Mother's Day."
Yeah, Happy Mother's Day. Here's a rose. I'd have to go back. I mean, well, actually, I'm sure I've shredded the notes. I probably hand wrote the notes back then. But I remember kind of going about it and saying, often we think that women don't have a place in the story, and going about it in this way. And I remember walking through, Rahab and Tamar, and imagine preaching on Tamar in your first sermon, and trying to navigate that. But, and just kind of pointing out like how unlikely these women are, and how every single one of them had a reason to probably look at themselves as not being usable. And I remember I told a story that I had heard, just trying to fit these little parabolic things into a sermon, especially when you're not comfortable preaching, is like, it's risky for sure. So, but I remember just like telling stories and telling a story about like, feeling like you're unusable, but then, finding out that it was your flaws that made you usable. And so I think that the overall message was probably good. And in all honesty, Mike, I'm sure I probably ripped it from somebody. Like I'm sure I had heard somebody else preach a similar message, and I was just kind of like, I'm going to add on to this. And, I think a lot of early preaching for me was probably inadvertent plagiarism, unfortunately. But I think that's probably fairly common for a lot of guys.
Yeah, I don't want to like just dismiss that, because I think that there's, we could do better. However, we could also do a whole lot worse. And
100%. And I found too, like, I had a lot of mentors early on and still do in preaching. And I found that, like you said, it's not a good thing, but it can be, like if you have men that you look up to, whether personally or even now through, the 21st century technology that we have, where you can genuinely say, hey, I've been influenced by this message and I want to pass it on. And I've found that there's a craft to making sure people understand, like, hey, I've heard this from somebody else and I just want to give it to you now, as opposed to just like downloading Tim Keller's stuff and just saying, hey, this is mine, So, but yeah, no, it's kind of like, good Lord, I don't know what my preaching would have sounded like if I hadn't borrowed early on from some of the guys who were much better than me.
Yeah. And I want to talk to you in just a moment about the ways that you have, grown since then. But you said something really interesting I want to come back to. So you said that your friend, the best man at the wedding.
Yeah.
So what was his name?
Brad.
Yeah, you said Brad, he gave you that kind of immediate feedback, which was like, hey, Jeremy was not as good as you think it was.
Yeah, that's pretty much what he said, actually. Yeah.
So that's so valuable. And has Brad helped in other ways, or why don't you talk to us a little bit?
Yeah,
I know I'm kind of all over the place, but the role of friends who love you enough to tell you that you didn't do amazing.
So. Yeah, I think you might have just nailed it. I think he pretty much said that exact thing. Hey, you seem to think it went really, really well. And he and I, like I said, we were roommates, and he was the exact same degree as me. So we had gone through pretty much all of our classes together. And, he went on to, he's not pastoring anymore, but he went on to serve in church ministry. And I mean, so he was definitely an opinion that I could respect, but I remember, and I think this is probably common for a lot of guys, I remember not receiving that well. I mean, I'm sure in my face and to him, but I remember, because early on, really for the first few years of me preaching, even in the pastorate, it was I look back now and realize how prideful I was, that like, because I was educated, because I felt like I knew a lot, I would regurgitate, and and you know, I know for you and for Calvary guys and a lot of the people listening to this show belong in and around the Calvary Chapel movement, which that was a big influence on me. And so I used to get up there, and I'm sure I did that day, and I thought expositing the text was regurgitating commentaries about the text. And so I didn't receive that well, I don't think, at least not, you know, inwardly. But that was impactful for me to have somebody I respect not come up and pat me on the back like everybody else. And then throughout my time in ministry, there's been a few key people who have served in that role of like healthy, not critics, although it sure is sometimes critical or criticism, but like have served in that role of kind of like being my sounding board. And I've grown a lot from it. It's been one of the most valuable experiences I've had in teaching as a pastor.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, so that leads like really quite naturally into the next thing I'd love to hear. So like how has, or how, what's the proper grammar? Your teaching has improved. Yeah. I'm assuming since that fateful Mother's Day. Yeah, like, what are some of the ways that you've grown? Yeah. You taking Brad's advice on, or others? But like, how have you grown since then?
So it'd be hard to nail down one way. And of course, I've found, I'm sure you have too, like, we are often the least aware of ourselves. And so my wife has been a tremendous influence on me. For the first few years of my life in ministry, you know, my wife, unfortunately, I look back now and I realize I was probably putting an undue burden on her, because it was her job essentially. I thought too, when I got home, you know, the day, because we'll have multiple services here, so like I'll preach a couple times on a Sunday, and then over lunch she would tell me all the things that she liked, all the things she didn't, and while to anybody listening, if you have your wife do that, I don't recommend that, because I've come to learn that she wasn't able to engage with the text the way I was asking everybody else in the room to. And but it was helpful for me. But I would say that if I look back on the last 10 or 11 years, it's gone from trying to show what I know to trying to introduce the listener to the text in a way that is engaging to them, and in a way to which they will walk away with a deeper and more intimate understanding of the God who wrote it. And so sometimes, as you know, as an expositional teacher, like sometimes that is very academic. That is helping somebody understand Greek, Aramaic, or Hebrew, or a background context. But sometimes it's just, you know, putting aside what you read in a commentary that week, putting aside what you learned in seminary or graduate school, and just trying, you know, especially like here lately, like I've been working on a lot of stuff with the Sermon on the Mount, and just like right now, my fascination is trying to get people to understand like just how amazing Jesus was and is, you know? And so much, like quite a bit over the last 10 or 11 years of just saying, Jeremy, it does not matter what you know. And I've had men and women speak into my life, to do that. And to like, you know, like there's in particular, I'd say the biggest influence on my life in teaching has been, and actually I mentioned this in your group on Facebook a couple months ago, because somebody asked such a phenomenal question about like taking criticism well as a pastor. And there's this guy in my congregation, Gary, who now is a mentor of mine, but he started off as, he's a guy whose kids went through my student ministry, and he's a PhD in New Testament. He studied at Durham while N.T. Wright was the bishop there. Wrote his dissertation on the word charis in 1 Corinthians, and just all this ridiculous stuff. And so, as you can imagine, being like a 24-year-old youth pastor who gets to teach twice a year, and you get up there and you just give it your best fastball. And I would get off stage, and he would always have something to say. And it always felt like criticism. It always felt like gosh, man, leave me alone, you know. But as I started to listen more, and we started to get to know each other more outside of that context, it really became he became my sounding board, and really, I mean, like I said, he's a mentor now, because now, you know, I can engage with him and he can engage with me in a way that, like, if it weren't for him and people like him, his wife also she studied at Oxford, and so, like, they're just tremendous in general, but, like, and they're career missionaries in Eastern Europe. And so just, like, they have a license to speak into my life as a pastor and a teacher that most people don't. And I've gotten to a point where I'm receptive with them, to where when he says, hey, I remember just a couple months ago, I got off stage and I had taught and everything, and he was in there, and it was the first service, and I had another service to do, and he was leaving, and he said, he's like, the one thing he said, what are you trying to get across? What's the goal? And I tried to, like, I kind of stumbled through it, you know, like, oh, I want people to walk away with that. And he kind of, like, in between services helped me understand, like, hey, you're like a shotgun shell, right? It's all across he's like, but this is in between, Mike, this is in between two services. Okay. And he's like, get your thesis statement down and cut everything else out. And I remember, I mean, like, I went back to my little office and did that. And I remember after the second service being like, man, you know, he was right. And it hurts. Like, when people are right, we don't want them to be, but
Yeah.
so him and his wife, Karen, and then quite a few other people, I'm sure, too. I mean, I work with guys who are phenomenal teachers in their own right, too. So I've grown immensely, but it has almost, I mean, nothing to do with me. Everything to do with the Holy Spirit and the people God has put in my life that can speak into me as a pastor.
Wow. Yeah, you know, that's so valuable to have, him and his wife in the congregation, and that I wonder if he's changed his tone with you, or if you've changed the way that you've listened to what he's saying. You said
probably a little bit of both. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That it sounded like it was just, you know, a bunch of criticism at the beginning, and now he's become more helpful. Maybe you've changed the way you've listened.
It's probably mostly me, but I'm sure. I mean, we people have a tendency to soften as they get to know somebody better. But I mean, it's probably a little bit of both.
Well, I think there's a quote from Mark Twain. He said that, you know, when he was like 15 years old, his dad was like the most like ornery, you know, foolish idiot he ever met. And now that he's 25, he's seen that his dad is like, you know, a careful, thoughtful, wise person. And he's like, I can't believe how much my dad changed in those years.
Yeah, that's in man, like, I think about it all the time. So I'm 32 now, turned 33. I started at this church, and it's the only church I've served at vocationally, like, you know, as a paid pastor. I mean, like, there was the country church in college, but and you know, the crazy thing is people like Gary and his wife Karen and the people who've been at this church for a long time. I mean, what's the difference between a 23-year-old and a 33-year-old? Like, I mean, a million parts. And so you know, my church has watched me grow up, and it's a crazy thing to think about. And, you know, so I have people come up, people who've been here a long time, and kind of go, and, you know, it's, you don't know how to take this, but they're like, man, you've gotten so much better. And, like, you know, when I'm younger, I kind of go, what does that mean? What do you, you know, but now I just go, thank God, you know, like, because when you're, and, you know, you and I are both teachers and preachers, but we're pastors, you know, and that's the difference, is like, if I was just teaching, then somebody getting smarter from listening to me would be enough. But I'm a pastor. And so that's probably what's changed the most, is understanding, like, no, this needs to be transformative. And if for it to be transformative, I have to step aside and let the Holy Spirit move through me, and this wise counsel, these people that I have in my life, who are also hearing from the Holy Spirit, you know, they can help fill my cup. And so, I mean, serving 10 years at the same church, starting when you're 23, is a tremendous recipe for becoming more humble and becoming, you know, aware of your own flaws. Because when you're 23 and 24 and preaching to men and women who are 50 and 60 and 70 years old and have been Christians since years and years before you were born, is a tremendous recipe to find out how much you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've been at the same church since I was 2022, I think.
Okay, yeah.
And it's going on 17 years now.
Yeah.
Or, wait, my math is wrong. I'm bad at math, but for a long time. And I guess maybe an advantage stroke disadvantage that I have is we haven't had older people in the church until somewhat recently. For quite a long time, everyone has been my age and younger. Or usually even they'd be a few years younger than me to begin with. So it always was where my kids were the oldest kids in Sunday school.
Yeah.
And then kind of onwards and onwards. And that actually still kind of is the case. We're kind of still missing a certain demographic of people that are, let's say, 10 years older than me. They're not interested in learning from me. But people that are in there, we got a bunch of grandparents now, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
And they've even said those same sort of things. They've been coming for 5 years, and they said, we've seen growth in you over these 5 years, which is a very wonderful and kind thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the church I'm at, I've been here for right about 10 years, but the church is only 13 years old. It was a church plant when I got here. And we're just now really beginning to not feel like a church plant. And so I've been here for most of the life of the church, but for a long time, because we were a church plant and we were a very contemporary church in a very rural area of Western North Carolina, we appealed to young people. And now we're starting to see our congregation age and appeal to more people than just 20 and 30, like Gen X and millennials, and so we've gone through that same thing. But it's been a blessing to have more people from different generations be here, it's tempting as a pastor to only want to engage with young people, right? I think the forbidden fruit in church planting is just trying to get young people, and I've found that that's just a great way to shoot yourself in the foot from a church health standpoint, because as you found, having a congregation that's vastly intergenerational is and it's a reflection of Scripture, right? So you can't do Titus 2 if there's not older women to teach the younger women, and so on and so on. But so it's been a great blessing for us at Element to have a wide array of generations.
Well done. Congratulations. Thank the Lord for that. That's really good. And
absolutely.
I think, there was quite a surge of church planting, 10, 15 years ago. It was quite sexy for the time, but it's but what about not having the coolest church in town? I think maybe the goal should not be the cool church, but the faithful church, the intergenerational church, the church that's just slow and steady. Okay. So here's a question. I didn't send this one to you in advance, so this one's a curveball. So brace yourself. So I know from reading some of your stuff or listening to some of your podcasts, I know you got kind of a mind for apologetics or worldview analysis. How does that filter into your Sunday messages? When you get to preach, do you think there should be an apologetic angle to it, or is there ways to use that or misuse that?
So I teach on a teaching team where myself and two other guys are the primary teachers. We revolve. I right now I teach every third week, and then various other times throughout the week in other ministries. And then we have other guys who come in. And I am super lucky to serve with these two guys who are vastly different than me. And they're, two of my best friends. And, like I said, I've grown up with them basically as my older brothers. And so it's just this really thing that to listeners, I would say, man, it'd be hard to try and find that, but just pray for that kind of environment because it's very fostering. But so in worldview analysis, I like that. That's a great way to say it is it does bleed through in my teaching. So I have, I think Phil Metzger out of Calvary San Diego.
Yeah.
He and I have talked a little bit. He thinks the same way I do. I think he has a degree in intercultural studies. My master's in intercultural studies. So I work a lot in comparative religion academically and apologetics and, like you said, worldview analysis. And so I found that here in my rural church in Western North Carolina, not everybody is as interested in Hinduism and Islam as I am. Not everybody is as interested in apologetics as I am. So I've found that I have to be careful to not make it the whole of my teaching. But I think it has benefited my teaching and hopefully my congregation, because, when I do see something in the text where I'll say, hey, most people in the world do not think this way. It's helped for me and my congregation to understand the uniqueness of Christianity and in Christ, to compare Christianity and Jesus to what other people think in the rest of the world. And so I would say the reason why I like worldview analysis, because I don't think apologetics shows up as much in my teaching as it does with like some of the stuff that we do with All Things, All People. Like if I'm engaging with something like 1 Corinthians 15, which one of the pastors here taught on yesterday, I might engage apologetically because there is an apologetic to that passage.
Sure.
Paul is saying the importance of the resurrection, and even he is offering up an apologetic for it. But I found that, the people in the room, the best thing for them, if apologetics is going to bleed into the teaching, is just, they're sitting there, and whether they realize it or not, many of them are sitting there and going, is this actually true? Is this true? Even as a pastor in my life, I've gone through seasons where it's not like I've doubted my faith, but I've kind of gone through and it's like, okay, so what do I do with this? This is a very difficult text. This is a very difficult concept. And apologetics as a pastor can help engage somebody at their core level and say, it is true. And this is one way that we know how. So I would say the term that you just kind of threw out, worldview analysis, is probably more of what ends up in my teaching as opposed to an apologetic. And it's mostly to help myself and my congregation understand that, like, hey, everybody in our small town says they're a Christian. Most of them are not. And also, there's 7.3 billion people on planet Earth, and most of them don't see the world the way you do. And even if you never leave Western North Carolina, you need to know that. You need to understand that. And that helps bring people's theology and view of God out of a vacuum, I've found.
Oh man. Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Like, with no prep, thank you so much for such a thoughtful answer. I could tell that you spend a lot of time thinking about these types of things.
Well, I appreciate that. That's definitely, I try to. And with All Things, All People, like, one big thing that we're working on right now is this idea of, like, think like a Christian, and engaging with how Jesus thought about things. And, I just had I had a radical experience a few years ago, of, like, I had never really traveled. I had never really studied any other world religions or anything like that, or competing philosophies to Christianity. And once I did, I began to realize, like, hey, we really need to be more aware. Not everybody needs to be as aware as I am, because it's a passion of mine. But
good point. Yeah.
But I just found, like, American Christians really think that everybody thinks like them, and I've just found it's like, man, they don't. And and when once you understand that, it brings a dose of humility that I actually think leads to a deeper sanctification, and, like you said, a thoughtfulness that kind of makes you, like, as James would say, like, be slow to speak and quick to listen. And I found that I've interviewed a lot of apologists on my show, and my favorite ones are the ones that don't act like apologists, like the ones that don't throw out these little pithy, quick sound bites and arguments for every little thing. But, like, a guy like Andy Bannister, who is in the UK, and he listens more than he talks. And so yeah, it's kind of like, I'd like to be that kind of pastor. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of, like, that kind of pastor, you mentioned that, you're on a preaching team. So there's two other regular preachers. I mean, and does that kind of almost, like, give you more kind of permission to, like, to be the kind of worldview guy? If someone else is going to be the, everyone has kind of their thing or their emphasis. And then, like, every third Sunday, there's going to be an emphasis on this coming from you.
Yeah. So you're spot on, but it's funny because when I first started, it wasn't me and two other guys. Like, I was the youth pastor, and I was a fill-in, and
sure,
and things like that,
or the Sunday after Christmas, when nobody wants to preach in the first place,
youth Sunday, yeah. So now it's a great thing for me because I feel like I can be myself. And, there's a little bit too, like I hear people in the congregation who I think that they're joking, but like, the idea of like, oh, Jeremy's preaching, so it's going to be academic. And it's like, I don't want it to always be that way. And I don't think it is, but yeah, Mike, you hit it on the head because like the two guys that I work with primarily, one is a phenomenal storyteller. Like he's a fantastic teacher, and he navigates the word very thoughtfully and very well, but he ends up, it feels like he's telling you a story. And then the other guy is he's actually the one who founded the church. His name's Neil. He was a youth pastor for 20 years, and I still think at his heart he is a youth pastor because he uses visual aids and everything rhymes, and he has this alliterative gift that I could never have of everything starts with the same letter. And he kind of like, he was really influenced by guys like Andy Stanley and that movement in the 90s and early 2000s where it was very engaging to people who hadn't grown up in church. And so when I first started in ministry, I felt like I don't know where I got this, but I felt like I had to preach like them because I was serving at their church. And that, like, if you go back and listen, I've tried to get them to delete those sermons because it's like, if you go back and listen, I'm sure it doesn't really sound anything like what I sound like now. But I had this older pastor who had actually served at, lo and behold, a Calvary Chapel in Phoenix, Calvary Community in Phoenix, I think. And he had moved out here. He had become part of our congregation. Now he's basically an elder at our church. And I just was venting some frustration to him. And I was like, man, I can't, I'm not as funny as him. I'm not as engaging. I don't like using visual aids and all these things, although I've definitely grown to use visual aids more. And he said, and this is funny because it brings us back full circle to kind of like you and Expositors Collective, but he was like, well, hey man, go see what Broderson does. And I had engaged with Brian Broderson's teaching when I was in college because I was at Calvary Lynchburg and had really become a great admirer of a lot of the Calvary guys, Chuck Smith, Broderson, Skip Heitzig. And I think shortly after is when I found your show.
Is that
because
right? Okay.
I think you had, I don't know how long you've been doing it, but like when you type in expositional preaching, you're on the first page of Google, I think. And so right there with Brian Chappell and Chuck Smith and all those other guys, who I'm sure you feel like you're right up there with them, But
I was just going to say, yeah, as it should be, rightly so, yes.
Yeah. So, but so I started listening to Broderson and Tim Keller and all these guys and just feeling more of a license to do it the way I felt led to do it. And actually, these two guys specifically, Neil and JR, who I work with primarily now, they were hugely supportive of that. Like they did not at all want me to try and fit some cookie cutter mold that like they didn't want me to try and teach like them. So I think it provides a strength of like, yeah, Jeremy is a little bit more Calvary Chapel-ish, he's more academic, but it also, I think, allows them to be more liberated in how they go about their teaching too. So it's a tremendous strength. And, but like I said, when I felt, the pressure to do what they did, man, I can't even imagine how bad that probably was. Like I said, if I could go in and they probably don't give me the password to the website archive because they know what I would do with it. So, but yeah, it was a great lesson just kind of going, hey, what do you want to do? Go be who God's designed you to be.
Yeah, and that's maturity and humility on their ends. It must be very like ego stroking to have someone say, "Listen, I emulate you. I want to copy you," and then very humble for them to say, "But I don't want you to be like me. I want you to be more like you." And everyone benefits from it, as we said earlier on. Like the church gets these these three distinct voices instead of one voice with two variations of.
Yeah, or one voice that is very natural and one voice that is mimicking the natural. And
right.
And even when I was a youth pastor, I don't know. You'd have to ask the students who grew up with me as a youth pastor exactly what I was, but I didn't feel like the typical youth pastor. I didn't feel like the guy who was doing cartwheels and being really funny and all that stuff. And it was crazy too, because like on a Wednesday, I would teach the way that was natural for me to teach. And then on Sundays, I was trying to be something else. And so I think in that way, student ministry was a tremendous teaching opportunity for me, as it is for a lot of guys, because you're teaching, basically 40 to 50 times a year, and really get to find your method and what works for you, and the way you feel called by God to do that. So student ministry was a tremendous teaching opportunity for me.
Wow. Well, I mean, now to kind of to pivot to ask, so that was student ministry, and now you're like regularly preaching or teaching.
Sure.
Could you maybe walk us through your routine? So you have a Sunday; it's coming up. I don't know when your next one on the calendar is, but what are you doing now to get ready for then?
Yeah. So, and I know for a lot of guys, there's a lot of guys that teach 50 times a year that don't have the privilege that I have to have 2 to 3 weeks to be thinking and meditating. But normally, if we're walking through a series, we do series at our church, so we do a lot of topical stuff, but within the topical stuff, like once I know the text that I'm going to teach, I might spend a week or two, or usually just like kind of a week or a few days, just reading it. I'll get it on Dwell, or not Dwell. Dwell. Yeah. I'll listen to it. I'll try and memorize it if I can, if it's something that, would be beneficial to memorize if it's not a huge chunk of scripture. But just, engage with the text. And I think I learned that from Brian Broderson, listening to him talk about his method, and a lot of guys I know that do that, of just say, hey, just read it. Just read it. And read it in different translations and things like that. From there, I will definitely begin to engage the helps, so I might engage a few commentaries. One thing I've learned, the difference between when I first started to now, is I used to try and read every commentary that I could get my hands on, right? So if I'm engaging with John 10, I'm going to read every commentary on my bookshelf. I'm going to look up on Logos or Blue Letter Bible everything that Guzik says, everything that John Stott says, everything that Spurgeon preached on it. And it's just, that became very burdening. So I began to kind of pick out a few that I typically go to, which my biggest one now is John Stott. That's probably theologically the greatest influence that I've had in my life, which is funny because, once again, I'm not Anglican.
You're not Anglican,
but just kind of, taking, and a lot of guys like him, the influence goes far beyond what denomination they were, of course. But so Stott and Tim Keller, I'll listen to maybe Keller, what he has to say about it. But then just kind of go back into like figuring out what was the background context. I think that's probably the thing I learned academically early on that I've never lost, is like, what was Paul experiencing? Like, one big thing that I've taught, because now being only 32, I'm beginning to have the first generation of guys that are younger than me who are also preaching and teaching. And so like, that's probably been my number one thing for them, is like, don't worry about Greek, don't worry about Hebrew right now. Just figure out what was going on, how far, like if it's in the New Testament, if it's an epistle, how long after the resurrection and the life of Jesus was it, right? And begin to think through, like, so if Peter wrote it and it was, 20 years after the life of Jesus, like, think about that, like, just meditate on that for a minute, right? So for Paul, right, think about, where is it in his journeys? Is he about to be martyred? What journey is it? And so on and so on. So like, just figuring that out, which of course, if you have a good study Bible, that stuff is given to you the first page of every book.
Yeah.
And so nowadays it's like, there's no excuse not to be able to engage with background information. So engage with the background information, figure out timing, figure out thematic and narrative elements, just kind of, so like, don't be consumed by that stuff, but just like walk into it knowing it. And then probably the last thing I do before I start writing would be maybe some word studies. If I need to do a word study, if there's, especially if it's Paul, like, it just ends up being that, like, if you're teaching on like Romans 12:2, like you're going to do a study on the difference between conformed and transformed and things like that. So, and then you just write and you kind of figure out, okay, so like the thesis statement, and that's going back to like, being told like, don't go in and have 3 goals for the congregation or for the sermon, and then just kind of figure out like, okay, so what are you wanting to tell? What story are you wanting to tell? What do you want people to walk away with a deeper understanding of that hopefully is going to be transformative? And then, one area that lately in my just pastoring life has been trying to grow more obedient in prayer, trying to grow more obedient in for years, probably looking at a sermon as my opportunity to grow the people listening and not seeing much fruit or growth, or at least what I was expecting, and beginning to understand it's like, well, Jeremy, you didn't pray. You didn't engage with God, and like you preached a good message, but God had something greater in mind for the church and you missed that opportunity. And so now, and I say that, Mike, like as somebody who is still like that, I'm just not naturally, it sounds bad for a pastor to say, like, I am not naturally good at praying. Like I'm not naturally somebody who, I'm around guys who just, it seems like their prayer life is so vibrant, and I have to daily work on that. And so like that's probably been recently the biggest thing in my teaching and preaching life that I'm trying to be an obedient in. It's just like, put John Stott aside, put Keller aside, and just seek his face. And I'm trying to get better at that, and then you get up and my notes are very formulaic. I have a notebook that I put all my notes in, and they probably all look the same. And I have a little code, for, just little stuff like, I highlight anything that's going to be on a slide, so that when I'm looking at my notes, once I see yellow, I know that it's on the screen on stage, and little stuff like that I've just kind of picked up through the years. But yeah, so I mean, that's my process from week to week. Of course, there's a ton of deviation from week to week, and and then, and the great thing too is I work at a church where we're very communal. Like when I'm done with this interview, I'm probably going to walk out and get a cup of coffee. There's going to be like 2 guys in our little cafe area. And from time to time, I will engage with those guys with like, hey, what do you think about this? And that's dangerous, because if you do that on a Friday before you preach, like, don't do that, but early on in the stages, I work with some guys that, their biblical knowledge is just as much as mine, and their relationships with God have formed and shaped mine. So I like going to their offices and going, hey, I think I'm going to do this. And they go, hey, if it was me, I'd do this. And I walk back to my office and I go, dang it, he's right. That's really what the church needs to hear, And so yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm sure the next time I preach, it'll probably be vastly different because I just, made it all sound so good. But yeah, so that's kind of, that's my goal most times. It's like, that's what I want it to look like.
Well, that's valuable, and I like at the Expositors Collective, we're really big on like what you talked about, like asking 2 different people, like, hey, what do you think about this? We're emphasizing not just expositing, but like collectively, like the idea of not having it be merely or solely a solitary activity, but involving other people. But you're right. I like how you kind of carefully said that could be something that's beneficial, or there could be a danger to it as well. So,
well,
thank you for emphasizing both of those.
Yeah. Well, and especially we live in a world now where I can go consult Tim Keller.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, I can't okay. So my 2 big influences, like it's such a strange world that like I have influences that I know, and then I have influences of guys that I don't know. And you have to be really careful with the guys you don't know, because Tim Keller, in my opinion, is one of the best teachers that we've seen in the last, I don't know how many years. Like I've been tremendously blessed and influenced by his teaching. I have to be careful to not, if I'm teaching John 10, to not, someday there will literally be times where I won't go listen to what he has to say. I won't go listen to Broderson's sermons. I won't go listen to somebody else, because I go, Tim Keller is not the pastor of my church. And in my opinion, he's usually going to do a better, at least what I would consider to be a better job. So I'm going to be tempted to just do what he did and say what he said. And because he's influenced me, but Tim Keller was not called to pastor Element Church, right?
That's right.
And so that's been a difficult thing for me growing up in this generation, where I can listen to your sermons. I can listen to, Brian Broderson's sermons. I can listen to Skip Heitzig and so on and so on. And it's like, that's probably one of the big pitfalls that I think a lot of guys are falling into, is the comparison trap of not just the guy down the street, but the guy in New York and the guy in Costa Mesa. And it's like, that's really dangerous. And that's a pitfall in my own life that I've had to learn to avoid, is like, don't compare yourself to anybody. I like what you said, be a part of a collective experience of guys who have like-minded goals in their teaching and preaching. And that can happen with these megachurch preachers, or just, guys that are putting the sermons out in a podcast. That can happen. But if you're going to these guys and to drink at their well, that's dangerous as a teacher.
Yeah, or to mix analogies, somebody said that you should you milk many cows, but you churn your own butter. Which is kind of a little bit of a concerning.
It sounds grotesque, but I 100% agree.
Yeah. But like, this has been like absolutely delightful. Like we could go on for another 45 minutes, because we are like enthusiastic about like exactly the same things. I think this has been valuable for me and for our hearers as well. So how can people like connect with you, or again, I've mentioned your podcast already. You want to point people towards?
Sure. Well, now I'm realizing too, it's like, well, there needs to be a Mike Neglia episode of the All Things All People podcast. So, because we need to continue this conversation.
They're all Mike Neglia episodes.
Yeah.
Not the case.
So people, if they want to check out the podcast, of course, that'd be tremendous. And you and I are both part of Good Lion Network, and so there's a million great shows on that now, and we're privileged to be a part of that. So but you can go to Instagram, allthings.allpeople. If anybody wants to email me, it's jeremy@allthingsallpeople.org, which is also the website. And feel free, to check out our church. I mean, we're a small church in Rutherford County, North Carolina, but I would just, if there's somebody who wants to check that out, I think elementc3.com. And so, would love to engage with your listeners, and like I said, would love to have you on my show, so my listeners can engage with you and the great work that you've done at Expositors Collective, which is, it's benefited me and my team. Like I said, you and I were talking about the latest episode of my show. I think the episode starts off with us talking about your show, and so I really appreciate the work that you're doing. It's I think affected the church more than you realize, and so it's been a lot of fun to be on the show, and glad to be a part of the same network family of podcasts.
You're too kind. You started off by saying all these nice things, and now it ends saying all these nice things. I do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that was great, and thanks again, Jeremy, for your very, very kind words. There's going to be links in the show notes for all those things that we've mentioned here, ways that we can connect to Jeremy's church, and then also the All Things, All People podcast and ministry. In the conversation, he mentioned our Facebook group. And if you're not a part of that, you're invited. You can find it at facebook.com/groups/Expositors Collective. So we have like a public page where we have, quotes about preaching and advertisements for the various events and podcasts and that kind of thing. But we do have a group, which is kind of a private, walled conversation where we speak about how we're trying to grow and improve in our personal study and public proclamation of God's Word. As Jeremy was mentioning, it's kind of a vibrant community of interaction, and as teachers and preachers, a lot of times we're interested in kind of more of the nuances or kind of nerdy things, and it's nice to be able to geek out together, but also to be encouraged to teach and preach with authority and conviction. And hopefully that group is something that can be of encouragement to you. So again, facebook.com/groups/expositors collective. You're going to have to answer a few questions at the beginning, and then myself or Nick Cady will approve you, and then you'll be in the group. Okay. I hope that this podcast, I hope that the group, I hope that all that we do here at the Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word. And this clip from next week's episode actually ties in so perfectly with the big theme of this week. This is a conversation that I got to have with Joe Thorne, somebody whose books and articles have been incredibly helpful to me personally over the past 5 or 6 years. But we speak about his younger preaching years and one specific mentor that he had and the feedback that he received. We talk about that in the beginning of the episode, and then later on at the end, we have an even longer, extended conversation on how to set up the kind of relationships that welcome and invite constructive criticism and feedback. So I'm going to leave you with this 3-minute clip from next Tuesday's episode. Make sure that you are already subscribed so that this automatically shows up in your phone or in your device. It's not going to be one that you want to miss.
He was just super happy to have a young person that was called to ministry that was ready to go and preach. And so as long as I was accurate, he was happy. I mean, he wasn't a great preacher.
Okay.
I mean, just to be honest, that wasn't his particular gift.
He probably doesn't subscribe to this podcast, so don't worry.
I'm not worried about it. So I don't worry about much. So he could preach well, and every once in a while he would kill it. But yeah, no, he was just a guy that was excited. So he didn't do a lot of training in terms of like my preaching. He just gave me opportunity, and then he would give me some feedback. The training that I got from him had to do more with ecclesiology and church polity and things like that.
Okay. Well, getting even feedback, that is a bit of a head start over some people. In some Christian circles, there's like a reverence for the Word of God, or they want to be encouraging to people. And so sometimes the only feedback people get, at least that I got for years, was just that really blessed me. Or, or good job, but no one to say like, well, it was good and here's why, or, it could need improvement and these are the things that need to be improved. So you just kind of, oftentimes young or new preachers are just doing their best for vague senses of like affirmation rather than specific feedback.
Yeah. You get it. You people are going to generally give you a thumbs up. Unless you're just really butchering the text, right? Because they know you're young, they know you're starting out, or if you're not young, they know you're new to it.
Yeah. And
so they're going to try to be encouraging, which is why it's important that you find people that will actually speak into your work, your craft, and say, this was good, this was weak, here's something that you ought to be considering in terms of improvement.